Hello YouTube! So, I was pretty excited to make a video today. I was going to go into Elder Scrolls Blades and show you a pretty big discovery that a friend of mine has made in the game. Because there's been added some new lore in the game which confirms a lot of my political speculations of the 4th era that I've had over the years. Unfortunately, recently my Elder Scrolls Blades account just got resetted for some reason. I never asked for that, or I never did anything to ask for it, but you know, Bethesda. It just happened. And now my account is gone. I contacted Bethesda support, but they've not really been helpful so far, but I don't want to say too much about that because they haven't finished helping me yet, even though it hasn't been so much help until now. So, I had to make another video for the day, so here we are today, talking about the first era, about actually an equally, maybe even more interesting topic that I've been wanting to talk about originally today, the Khajiit 16 Kingdoms period. So now let's quit whining about customer support not being helpful and let's just talk about the Khajiit for a bit. Let's go. So the Khajiit have always been kind of obscure in lore, because in general there isn't a lot of lore on them. Or at least there used to not be a lot of lore on them. But now with the addition of Elder Scrolls Online Elsweyr, they added some lore, some of which I will incorporate in this video today. Back in the early Meretic era, when every race was still on their respective continents, so the Needs on Atmora, the Altmer on Altmuris, the Yokudans on Yokuda, there were 3 races already present on Tamriel, primarily in the south of the continent. These were the Argonians, the Kothringi humans, and the Khajiit. Around this time, tribal life was the dominant way of life around Tamriel, with most of the Argonians, Khajiit and Kothringi living in tribal societies. That isn't to say that there weren't significant civilizations present on Tamriel at the time, they were just largely tribal. In Blackmarsh, there was actually an exception, just like in Elsweyr. Because in Blackmarsh the Argonians had forsaken that tribal lifestyle and had established the great Zenmir civilization. I'm not talking about all the Argonians, but at least a significant portion of it. Which was said to be the most advanced civilization on Tamriel around this time. But as I sort of shadowed on before, there was another pretty big and relatively advanced civilization on Tamriel around this point, the Khajiit. Over the course of the Meretic era, the Khajiit of Elsweyr were living in, as we call it, the 16 Kingdoms period. The Khajiit themselves call this period the period of the 16 clans, because it's actually a little bit more complicated than there just being 16 kingdoms. To summarize, during the Meretic era, the Khajiit were split up into 16 clans. Each of these clans had some towns and small cities under their control, which were used as trading hubs between the different clans. These are largely the cities that we see in Elsweyr today, so these were founded during this period. These cities, under the control of the clans, were the main reason why the other peoples of Tamriel would call this the 16 Kingdoms period, as they viewed these 16 clans with their own trading hubs as kingdoms. The Khajiit themselves, however, view it rather differently. Because the Khajiit themselves say that except for those cities, the Khajiit clans had no claim over territory in the land, and the vast majority of the Khajiit during this point still belonged to the clans living in nomadic ways of life. However, over the course of the different centuries, more and more Khajiit would go to these cities that had been founded. This would lead to the name 16 Kingdoms actually getting some more merit. And we know that by the middle of the first era, that these 16 kingdoms were loosely ruled by a Khajiit called the Moon Emperor, who ruled the 16 kingdoms. How this emperor was chosen or how he or she came to the position that they held, we don't exactly know, or how their relation with the Main was at the time. However, I personally suspect that the process of getting a new Moon Emperor had something to do with the stance of the moons by the time of the previous Moon Emperor's death. Or maybe even the stance of the moons determined the abdication of the current emperor and would then lead to another emperor being instated. I don't say this just because their name is the Moon Emperor, but because the relations between the 16 kingdoms were also determined by the stances of the moons. You see, we know that during the early clan period, the dominant clan who would represent Elsweyr on the world stage and who had the most influence domestically was determined by the stance of the moons. This would continue into the kingdoms period, where the kingdom correlating with a certain stance of the moon, would have the most influence. Because each clan or kingdom had their own moment in the spotlight at some point, as for example when both moons were full, the kingdom of Anaquina, or the clan of Anaquina, would have been the dominant power over Elsweyr, while if they had 2 new moons for example, then the kingdom of Senchal would have the most dominant power. This shifting system of authority over the region actually worked out pretty well for the province's stability during this period, as the Khajiit probably had one of the most peaceful and prosperous civilizations during this period. The fact that there were 16 different entities cooperating made for a pretty complex but also very integrated economy. Each clan or kingdom had roughly their own area where they resided and had their own services and goods that they could provide or could not provide specifically. Every clan was trading with basically all the others, as each clan had something the others needed and that they were willing to trade for things that they needed. For example, we know that Anaquina provided warriors to the kingdom of Torval, which in exchange would provide Anaquina with the bounty of the sea, so for example fish, pearls, seaweed, etc. While we have always been aware of this 16 kingdoms period existing, it's only until now, with the release of the Elder Scrolls Online Elsweyr, that we have gained most of the knowledge that I've presented in this video. Elder Scrolls Online Elsweyr also gave us a book called The 16 Kingdoms, which states the name of each kingdom, their king or queen, and the thing that they are good at. This means that the verses provided in this book must have been written somewhere around the middle to late First Era, as this is the period when the so-called 16 kingdoms became actual kingdoms instead of clans. I will not fully read the book for you, but I will shortly tell you the names of the 16 kingdoms and the service that they provided in Elsweyr's economy. You had Anaquina, which provided warriors, Rimmon, who traded a lot with the outside world, Riverhold, who were farmers, June, which provided priests, Orcrest, of which we don't know exactly what their speciality are. We know that they had a lot of thieves, but I can't really imagine that being a thing that they could trade. You had Verkarth, which presumably provided archers, Mervale, which were artisan brewers, Helcon, which provided cattle, Alabaster, which had the best poets, the kingdom of Brook Ra, which were river traders and traffickers, Corinth, which provided wood and lumber, Pa Alatin, which were the mages, Tenmar, which provided furs, Torval, which brought fish and royal guards for the main, Canarthia, who brought sugar and fish, and finally Senchal, who provided sea trade and apparently also medicine in some form. Something interesting of note here is that Canarthia was most likely the island of Canarthi's Roost, which is more or less a sort of noob island in the Elder Scrolls Online. Of course, each kingdom provided more services and goods than just the things that I've listed here. However, this is what the documentation that we have actually says, because other than that we don't really have any documentation on the period. This extremely integrated economy that they had and the political stability following from it and the cycle of leadership made Elsweyr probably the most stable province on Tamriel for centuries, and in addition to that it made it so that the Khajiit stood strong and united against any invading powers, making it so that Elsweyr has been independent and sovereign since the beginning of the Meridic era until basically the late First Era. As the period of the 16 kingdoms came to an end in the late First Era in the year 2260 of the First Era, when the Thracian plague ravaged Tamriel, causing for a great lowering in Tamriel's population because so many of the individuals living on Tamriel died because of the plague. In this period the Khajiit also suffered terribly, and because of it the province's balance of power was basically more or less gone and has changed radically. Current literature from Elsweyr states that after the plague, many of the still tribal Khajiit migrated to the cities to avoid starvation, and after this mass urbanization that followed out of the fear for starvation, 2 clans took power over all of Elsweyr, Anaquina and Palatine. Literature does not exactly tell us whether this happened by force or if this happened because the clans simply merged due to the massive population loss around Elsweyr. I personally suspect the latter, that the clans, due to the many losses in population and their decreasing size, simply decided to merge. It doesn't really matter how this situation came to be, because this was the moment in the late First Era which would be the end of Elsweyr unity, as from that moment on the 2 kingdoms would be split on ideology, way of life, and many other things, like for example their geographical factors, and they would try to be more independent from the other. After the starvation had been prevented, most of Anaquina's former tribal communities went back to a tribal way of life, while most tribal communities in Palatine simply remained in the cities and went over to a sedentary lifestyle like most of the other civilizations in Tamriel had. It's said that at least for the first century of its existence, most Khajiit of Anaquina would look at Palatine and only see corruption and bureaucracy, while Palatine would look at Anaquina and only see laziness and barbarians. This basically meant the end of the 16 Kingdoms period, in my opinion one of the more interesting pieces of Khajiit lore, as it was to an extent truly a unique system on Tamriel. I really hope that you liked this video. It's a topic that I've been wanting to cover for a while and was planning to do next week actually, but yeah, due to problems with Elder Scrolls Blades and Bethesda customer support, it had to happen this week. So, with that behind us, I first wish to thank all my top patrons, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Metalloid1v1, Hayden Barnes and Gabriel Binda. These guys, along with the other people on screen, are who make all my weekly lore series possible. That said, if you liked it, like, subscribe, those kind of things, if you want to see more lore content on this channel. And yeah, I think I'm gonna go for now, and I'm gonna see if I can send another angry email to Bethesda customer support, because that is what this will take, unfortunately. Bye bye.